Hi there, folks. Well, it's another wet and windy Tuesday evening down here near Wollongong. Welcome to my latest live stream. I've got Adam teed up, ready to come in a moment or two, but just allow the dust to settle, get people coming on still. Nice to see some familiar faces, some new names as well, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation tonight about all things crypto related, but I think we're going to have to steer into some politics as well because it's all part of the great continuum. But there's a few things I need to do, of course. The first is there's doggy cams. I can tell you that our dogs don't like the rain. They refuse to go out until I drag them out. They both sit on the steps saying, "Turn it off." I then take them out for a walk and they come back and then shake themselves all over the place, and then I have to wipe their feet and bring them back in again. It's been a full-time job just looking after the doggies the last a few days with all of this rain, but there they are, sound asleep. So I may well come back and visit Doggy Cam during the show just to give people a little bit of joy and enthusiasm. Just to explain, I should, Luna is the one at the front and Meteor is the one at the back there. Both sound asleep, and they're not stuffed, they are real. Okay, now we'll just let this go for another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started with the main show. And nice to see some of the pre-show comments. I didn't put them up on the way through. I might pick a few as we go forward, but some interesting debate there about oil prices, what happens, how they're going to go up further, exchange rates and interest rates and things like that. So some interesting conversations that we'll probably come back to as we go through this evening. Anyhow, let me take the pre-show off. I'm just going to then run my intro and I'll be back in just a moment. Stand by. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 8th of March 2022. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on board. Thanks very much for spending some of your Tuesday evening. I hope that if you're in an area where there's a lot of wetness, you are able to be dry and safe. My thoughts are with all those out there who are struggling with orders to move and all those things, and there's just so much chaos even locally here around here, as well as up towards Sydney and down to the south coast and up towards Queensland. So anyway, I do pass my best wishes to all of those battling with the floods. Anyway, we're going to have a bit of a conversation tonight about crypto and crypto related issues, and I think the theme will be the convergence of crypto and mainstream in all sorts of interesting ways. So that'll be quite a fruitful conversation, I think. But before we do that, let me just put my normal warning up that this is not financial or legal advice. We do moderate the stream, so please play nice in the chat room. This is as at the 8th of March 2022 if you're watching in replay. If you would like to ask a question, use @WalkTheWorld to make sure that I see your questions. There's always lots going on in the chat. I do encourage that, but it's important if you want me to see it to make sure you use @WalkTheWorld. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your question top of the list, or indeed if you'd like to make a contribution to the running of the show, you can also use Super Chat to do that as well. Okay, well, that's interesting. I was just out to bring Adam in. He just disappeared, so I'm not quite sure what has happened. He did say that he had a couple of power cuts, so it may well be that he's actually gone off air. Hopefully he'll pop back, so hang on with that thought. In the meantime, I will continue with some of the stuff that I'd prepared with regard to tonight's show, and I think a good place to start will be looking at the cryptocurrency, and we'll go with Bitcoin. Just reporting where it currently is at the moment. So it's sitting at the moment at 38,906. You can see, of course, if you go back from October last year, we were up at 68,000 there. Of course, it's been up and down since then. The moving average, I've got the 200-day moving average up there, is at 40,127, so it's below its 200-day moving average. which is quite often regarded as a bit of a sign of potentially more potential risk to what's going to happen going forward. And I will just mention Ethereum, which of course is the other biggie as well, and it's worth just looking at that because that's also quite interesting. And again, you see that it's sitting there below its 200-day moving average, so that's also going interesting. Read at 2574 relative to the moving average of 2730. So that's that one. Let me just see whether I can get Adam back. He's not come back on yet, so I suspect it was a power cut. So I have no idea how long he will be off, which makes life extremely interesting, but there we go. Now, what I wanted to do, though, was here we go. Adam is now coming back in, hopefully. Let's see whether I can bring him back in, and if I can, and get everything teed up. Hello again, Adam. Just connecting. We'll see whether we can get you back. Yay, hello. You're back. Yeah, well, let me just bring you on live. There you go. Now, hopefully, is that working? Now, why isn't that working? Let me have a little think here. Well, maybe it is. No, maybe it isn't. Hang on a moment.
I'll bring you up on YouTube.
There you go. Gotcha.
I'm back.
So what happened? We had a bit of a power cut.
No, the internet cut. So literally just as we started to launch into the meeting, I lost all internet connection. So I've replugged in, and sorry to the viewers out there. We've got big storms down here at the National Capital, as there are many storms across Australia. Thoughts and prayers to the people in Queensland who are really doing it tough. But evidently these rough winds and rising tides to an extent where I am, it's having an impact on all our connections. I've had trouble with the internet all day, so hopefully we can make it through the interview, Martin.
Well, we'll hope so. I was just making it up by showing people the latest trend on Bitcoin, because of course it's down at 38 at the moment. Go back a few months, it was at 68. So, and then Ethereum. Now, it's very interesting. It really is very interesting listening and watching what people are saying, because I can give you two alternative narratives, and I thought I might start this conversation by giving you those two alternative narratives, right? So here's one, right? This is actually Bitcoin momentum, right? Which basically is talking about the fact that it's pretty stagnant, and people are saying, well, maybe it could break and move down, and it could down to a level of 20 to 34K, right? So that's sort of one end of the spectrum, right? But then, if you look at the other end of the spectrum, right, and Kiyosaki, by the way, is saying you should buy Bitcoin at the moment. There are people saying it's going to reach 100,000 by 2024. Skybridge Capital have bought big. Tethers being used in Switzerland as a sort of means of exchange, etc., etc. So you've got this huge divergence about what's going on, and whether it's actually going up, going down, going sideways. So let me just get you to put your stake in the ground, right? We are at 38, if I take Bitcoin. What's your sense? Is it going to go high, or do you think we're going to see it go sideways or down? What's your read at the moment, Adam?
Well, of course, nothing we say here is financial advice, Martin, but I'm more than confident I'm going to see $1 million Bitcoin in my lifetime. We can see that fiat is collapsing continually, and although it looks like Bitcoin has pulled back at the moment, as I always say, compared to 5 years ago, we're still up hundreds of thousands of percent, and 10, 13 years ago, we're up over 1 million percent. So it's all in perspective. The reality is that the financial system of fiat is collapsing. It's been collapsing for a long time, and the reason why we've been able to keep this sinking ship afloat that is fiat is because we've never had an alternative. Now we do have an alternative. What happens is so many people get so focused on just the price performance at the moment, they forget to look at the big picture. So if you had bought a house 5 years ago, it's certainly gone up in value, but we go back to what is the anchor point? Has it really gone up in value, or is it just that everyone else's money has been diluted? And to be perfectly fair, it's the same with Bitcoin. Has Bitcoin gone up in value, or is it just that compared to inflation, it's a much higher price. Now, the answer is most certainly Bitcoin has gone up in value because more people are using it and more people want to use it and more people are trying to hold it. And it is so scarce. We can see that even during these big dips, what's actually happening is many people are buying OTC, that's over the counter, or directly from the miners. What really drives up price is, of course, the markets, the books. When we see the market orders, and there's a lot of buy orders in there, and there's not many sell orders, the price goes up. So many of the big whales who try to accumulate this stuff, knowing that it is the future of money as either the main medium of exchange where we push money around the world, or as the reserve, as we put gold bars into a safe, whichever it is, they don't want to push the price up too quickly. Allow me to explain. If I put $1 billion, let's say, on the exchange, on the crypto exchanges, to say I want to buy X thousand Bitcoin, well, that's going to drive the price up. And suddenly you're going to have all these people FOMOing into the market and they're going to drive that price up. But if I can buy OTC, over the counter or directly from the miners, I'm still accumulating that Bitcoin, but it's not triggering the price as much. So we're seeing these sort of two worlds when it comes to price. We can see on the open source blockchain that people are buying Bitcoin, taking it off exchanges and locking it into cold storage. Now, when we say they're locking it to cold storage, we can A, see it's not on an exchange, and B, it's not moving. So we can see that irrespective of what price is doing, people are still buying it and people are still locking it up. When you speak about Tether as an example and stable coins, this is a fantastic way of bypassing the SWIFT network. And I don't mean bypassing the SWIFT network to do something wrong, as in bypassing sanctions. I just mean that when I want to move money around the world, I had to do it recently. I was trademarking the crypto land, and I had to do a transfer to England. And I went onto the old SWIFT network, and it was painful. It was an absolute nightmare. Now, I had forgotten how painful the SWIFT network is because I just work in crypto. If anyone anywhere in the world needs money from me, and there's reason for me to send them that money, if they don't want crypto, as in like Bitcoin, Litecoin, and Ethereum, I can just send them a stable coin instantly for almost free. Now, why on earth would I use the SWIFT network where they determine what the exchange rate is? They operate only in business days. They require so much information. It was just so slow and cumbersome. When I now have an alternative to send money through the Internet of Money, we can look at this in two parts: Bitcoin and crypto. For me, I'm a big believer in crypto. I think it's the future of money. I think it's the future of the global reserve currency. And I think it's the future of getting rid of inflation forever. But if you don't like Bitcoin, fair enough. But you can't sort of deny the efficiency of the blockchain and sending money from point A to point B, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year at almost the speed of light for almost nothing compared to what we have in the SWIFT network.
Yeah, and I think, we've discussed before the utility of the blockchain and the future of money and all of those things. And in a way, I think that the conversation around Bitcoin is more from, is it an asset, is it sort of quasi-gold, et cetera. But in a way, Bitcoin is a bit of a first generation of a manifestation of something much bigger, right? Which is effectively, the future of money and the way that money runs. But it is worth just noting that, Bitcoin is down. And here's another interesting one. There was an ETF that was launched. This is the BetaShares Crypto Innovators ETF. In Australia, it was launched, a little while ago. And when it was first launched, the price was at $12.42, and now it's down to $5, right? And that's an interesting observation where effectively the mainstream financial system has sort of tried to muscle in and say, well, we can provide you exposure to the sorts of companies that are actually involved in crypto. So this isn't in crypto itself, it's companies involved in crypto, right? And as a result of what's happened, they've gone down in value quite a lot. So if you bought then at the top, then you're way off. And it comes back to this question that I always wrestle with, and we've touched it before, we'll touch it again, I'm sure, is the relationship between the world of crypto and the world of mainstream world of finance and how the two are merging. So I was reading the other day that some of the banks in the US are now offering their customers direct exposure to crypto as part of their banking services, for example, right?
I mean, if we look at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, they are now incorporating Bitcoin sales into their daily operating procedure. And what's very interesting about the Commonwealth Bank of Australia is that they didn't introduce it to CommSec, which, as you know, is their stock side of internet banking. They're introducing it to NetBank, which is their daily transactor. And this cannot be overstated. Think of all the stocks in the world as traditional stocks. They're all available one way or another, directly or indirectly, through CommSec or platforms alike. They are not available on your daily transaction accounts, whereas Bitcoin will be. So that in itself is a massive statement to say the biggest bank in Australia is moving towards Bitcoin, and they're not putting it on their trading side, they're putting it on their daily transaction side. Now, with that graph that you showed before, many people are being tricked into buying paper-backed Bitcoin. Bitcoin is so easy to buy and hold yourself. You don't need these third-party providers. You may say that I need an exchange to initially buy it. Fair enough. If you know what you're doing, you could do an atomic swap, which is where you are buying peer-to-peer, just like you and I. We just want to buy Bitcoin together. We don't actually need an exchange. But if you want to just come into the crypto land and just buy some Bitcoin yourself, you can use an exchange. You can either leave it on that exchange if you wish, or you can pull it off into cold storage. What's happening with these markets that are becoming monetized now is that you're right, the Wall Street boys and girls, they're coming into Bitcoin. Before they were laughing at it, and now they're getting involved in it, and they're trading it like a risk-off asset. They're sort of playing with it in conjunction with their traditional stocks. But Bitcoin is blind to all of this. This will have some short-term impact on the price of Bitcoin and the movement of Bitcoin. But even when you say Bitcoin is down, I again emphasize compared to when? Compared to last year? No, it's not. Compared to the year before? No, it's not. Compared to, go back the last 13 years, yep. This thing is up. And the price of extreme performance is extreme volatility. What we can see at the moment is when more and more people are coming into the crypto land, they're saying, well, can you buy it for me? So I'll give you an example. Many people know that I'm a crypto, and they almost give me money, like cash in the hand, and say, get me some Bitcoin. And my answer is always the same. No. You get your Bitcoin and you hold it. This is something that you can control yourself. If we invest into fiat or forex markets, you're at the whims of everyone else. If you invest into the stock exchange, arguably stock exchanges have many of the same properties of the crypto exchange. It's just that crypto moves so much quicker and so much further. And because the market caps are so small relative to what's happening in traditional stocks, we have the opportunity to get so much growth. But we have a saying in the crypto land, any bank that does not adopt Bitcoin by 2030, they're going to be blockbusted. All of them, guaranteed. And that is financial advice. Any bank that does not get involved in crypto one way or another, whether it's through a CBDC, whether it's through offering Bitcoin, whether it's through using the payment rails of stable coins, they will be blockbusted, because it is just like any type of information service saying, we're not going to use the internet, we're not going to have a website, we're just going to send information out via the post. Well, good luck. There might be some of the older generation who are happy with that, but the rest of the world is moving too fast. I'd also like to emphasize, Martin, is that just because we have Bitcoin doesn't mean we can't have cash. Now, you and I share values on this. We fought to stop the cash ban. Yep. And one of my subscribers recently wrote to me and was talking about the tragedy of what's happening in Queensland, and all the banks have closed down. So one argument is crypto will never work because if the internet shuts down, we can't use money. And what we can see is that banks are already moving towards the digital space. I recently released a video about all the bank branches and ATMs that are shutting down across Australia. Thousands upon thousands of ATMs have been taken out of the country, and they're just machines who distribute money automatically. And hundreds of branches across the big four are closing nationally. So the banks are already moving to a digital space. I'm saying, well, why do I need to use a centralized bank's digital space when I can use a completely open source, immutable, borderless, all-inclusive digital space that's freer, faster, cheaper, and fairer than what the banks are offering? But just because we use crypto doesn't mean we can't use fiat. That is, we can't use cash. We can see most certainly with what's happening in Australia at the moment, as I mentioned with one of my subs, they are in the floods. All the banking communication systems have gone down. They can't go to IGA or Woolworths and buy bread and milk because all of the POS, the point of sale terminals, are cut off. Therefore, they're only accepting cash. Now, irrespective, Bitcoin doesn't even come into this equation. This is someone who's trying to use fiat, and they can't use fiat to buy food and water at the shop because all the internet connections are cut off, which is why I'm a big believer in both cash and crypto.
And just on that, can you hold crypto locally, so your local wallet on your phone or whatever, and transfer it to somebody else decentralized? Or can you only do that if you're connected to the internet and therefore to the ledgers?
Okay, at its core, no. But on a layer 2 solution, yes. Let me explain the best way a layer 2 solution works. Think of gold as a layer 1. So we had big blocks of gold, and we put gold in we used to walk around with blocks of gold or coins of gold. And if we wanted to buy bread at the markets, and when I say we, I'm talking before I was even born, and even before you were born, my friend, we'd take gold down to the markets and we would give them the coin, and they would either test the coin for purity or weigh the coin or check it out, and they'd exchange this big, heavy chunk of metal. As time went on, we said, well, how about we put this gold in a safe? And that gold is in the safe where it's secure, and then we write a banknote against that. Then we walk around with banknotes, light pieces of paper, that we don't really sort of check for the purity of the paper. Sure, it can be forged, but ultimately when we think of banknotes, we go shopping and we just dollars and cents, we just hand it over to the cashier. And in the olden days, that used to be backed by gold. So think of cash as a layer 2 solution to gold. The gold is in the safe, and the only way we can check the safe is by physically going there. Now we look at this as Bitcoin. Bitcoin is figuratively the layer 1 gold that is in a safe, and that safe is the blockchain. But the layer 2 solution is what you just described, the opportunity where you can do faster, smaller, and easier transactions, arguably offline, and then consolidate those transactions at the end of the day, the hour, the week, or whatever it may be. So at its core, no, you need the internet, but we've actually expanded the blockchain capability through using radio waves. So there is a developer who's made blockchain access through like a CB radio as an example. So that is an example of the internet's down and you've got a CB radio. You send essentially noughts and ones, dots and dashes over the radio waves, and you can verify that transaction. The other thing that we've got is, of course, satellites. We now have nodes in satellites floating around the Earth. So even if there's a massive catastrophe where most of the Earth is taken out, you would still have the blockchain and the centralized data or the decentralized ledger stored somewhere on a satellite, on a node, floating around the Earth, so the blockchain lives on.
Okay, very interesting. But obviously, you know, the blockchain and the ledgers are still a critical part of the infrastructure. Now, here's an interesting question from Ray. Will there ever be crypto-based derivatives or derivatives linked to crypto? And I have a feeling there are already some derivatives.
Well, yeah, it comes down to the traditional Wall Street boys and girls treating this as one of their normal stocks, bonds, derivatives, etc. In simple, I don't know, and I'm not really in a position to give a qualified answer on that, except for the fact that we can see that initially Bitcoin was treated as this outlier, this weird thing, and only initially, let's face it, the computer nerds were the first to use it. Then we had the criminals on Silk Road who were selling bad stuff. Then they realized, hang on, you don't want to use Bitcoin to transact bad stuff, because then you leave a digital trail and you're very easily found out. So many people who did bad stuff on crypto years ago, they're starting to realize, hang on a second, there's a digital trail to what I did on the Silk Road and I could be found out. And that's a matter of fact. So the number one choice for, I guess, criminal activity is the US dollar. But when it comes to taking these new markets, these crypto markets, and putting an old spin on it, it is very likely. But many people are now learning is that it's just better to buy and hold. The more I travel through this crypto space, you can trade it, you can stake it, you can lend it, you can borrow it, and all are a valuable part of the ecosystem that are replicating the old financial systems. But ultimately, it is a new frontier. And although there will be, I don't want to say attacks, but uses of this new technology and the old paradigm, ultimately this is the future of money and we don't need these old systems.
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you that there are some derivatives already. You can get options on Bitcoin, for example. And in fact, some of the ETFs are based on options. There's still regulatory hurdles in most countries, particularly, for example, in the US, where the SEC is still being very restrictive on the sorts of things that can be developed. But it is absolutely the case that we are seeing a proliferation and a marrying, if you like, of all the thinking from Wall Street and all the financial engineers thinking, well, if I think of Bitcoin as another commodity, what can I bolt on it? So I can bolt on it, you know, a a price into the future, I can bolt onto it a derivative which allows me essentially an option to call at a particular price. All those things do exist now. And what's interesting is that we're seeing quite a proliferation to the point where I think there are some interesting parallels. So if you take gold, for example, right, there's about a 50-to-1 relationship between the gold underlying and all of the mountain of derivatives, futures, options, and everything else that are traded, to the point where the bulk of the trades aren't done on the underlying, the bulk of the trades are actually done on the derivatives, right? And in fact, the derivatives have a greater impact on the price of gold than the physical trading of gold itself, right? Now, I have a feeling that Bitcoin is going to evolve the same way, because we've got more and more of these financial players saying, well, I can click the ticket, I can click the ticket here, I can click the ticket by running an ETF, I can click the ticket by effectively, using derivatives and things. So what we're finding is that there's a whole bunch of extra monetization now going on, which at one level has reduced the pure tone of what Bitcoin was envisaged to be outside the system completely. It's now very much sort of partly in the financial system, right? But there's also an interesting story that says, to an extent, therefore, it can start transforming the financial system from within. The CBA example is quite interesting. So, but that will be my thought on it. I just want to show you just one other. This is the long-term trend for Bitcoin, right? I went back to 2013, right? So if you bought in the early days, even now, you are way, 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 way up. Of course, the problem is a lot of the new users of Bitcoin, particularly some of the retail buyers of Bitcoin, have been buying only recently. And if you bought, when you were in the 50s to 60,000, then you're down again. But again, as you say, Adam, I think it's important to emphasize, a lot of the founders and early adopters of Bitcoin are long-term holders, and they're still sitting on huge pools of assets simply because the price is up, down, but it's still a lot higher than it used to be.
Yeah, just going back on what you talk about, those derivatives market, if you actually look at all the distribution of money in the world, there's a chart, I think it's on Money Matters, and it's a visual representative of where all the money is in the world, and it's made up of lots of little cubes. And the derivatives market is more money than all the other markets combined. So if we take all the gold, the fiat, the real estate, bonds, stocks, precious metals, crypto, everything, even the debt markets, all of it, the derivatives market trumps all of them significantly. And you're also right when it comes to these gold paper markets, if you will. There's so many pieces of paper written against the one bit of gold. It's kind of like just a little bit of a casino. People are just betting on the future price. And the ETFs that you mentioned, America has introduced paper-backed ETFs in crypto in the States, but it's not real. Now we can see Canada has done spot-backed ETFs, so where you're really buying the Bitcoin. But what's going to happen is, yes, you're going to have this crossover of these old markets moving into the new markets, but noting that there's only, we estimate there's about 5% of the world's population that is involved in Bitcoin at the moment. It's hard to get a very accurate read on that, but let's for argument's sake say it is 5%. There's still 95% of the world's population that is not involved in Bitcoin. Now, taking that a step further, we know that 2/3 of the world's population is unbanked. So if we go to the derivatives markets or the gold markets, or the futures markets, or any of these markets that we speak about in the traditional financial sector, there's 2/3 of the world's population who can't get into it even if they want to, because they don't have the right documentation. They don't have the minimum $500 buy-in. They don't have access to these banking systems. But we know that more people in the world have access to a mobile phone than they do to a bank account. And as such, because people can buy 1 cent worth of Bitcoin or $1 million worth of Bitcoin, and it's available to anyone with a mobile phone connection, you can see how much demand is potentially going to be put onto this very, very rare asset, noting that only 5% of the world's population is sort of buying now. And the truth is, Martin, those who understand Bitcoin will never sell it. They will never, ever sell Bitcoin. They will borrow against it. Just as you wouldn't sell a skyscraper in Manhattan because that block of land and that building is constantly going up in value. You borrow against it so you don't have a tax liability, and so you can continue to own that asset. Those same models are now applying to the digital assets of cryptocurrency. If you've got $1 million worth of Bitcoin, instead of selling it, You borrow against it, you don't pay tax on it, there's no capital gains on it, and then you get to keep the asset that continues to go up. Now, of course, if it all crashes, you suddenly are liquidated on your position and you've got a loan against something that you don't own. But the same is with stocks, the same is with property, and the same is with arguably precious metals. But I'm glad that you can bring up that chart to show that, yes, it pulls back, but overall, the trend continues to go up, and there is no lack of demand on this. The demand on this precious digital metal per se, we call it digital gold, it is constantly going up. And even when the prices are pulling back, follow the money. The big players, they just scoop it up. The big players who understand money, they're not investing less in it, they're investing more in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting looking at the recent trends. There's a lot of new retail investors, small, relatively experienced people who've been piling in. And it's interesting how sometimes some of the more experienced investors have been able to be on the other side of the trade when the price comes back, because they're sort of thinking, oh, it's falling, maybe I should sell. And suddenly you find that some of those whales, as they're called, hoovered up.
Well, that's where that line of support is. We're finding that line of support is around the $38,000 mark. And in one of those comments that you brought up in the beginning of our discussion is that it's so funny. In crypto, if it's pumping, people get skeptical and say, it's pumping too fast, it's a scam. Yeah. If it's falling, people say, I told you it's a scam, it's falling. But then if it's remaining constant, which we're actually starting to see a lot of stability in this, we're actually starting to see that it's getting a lot of support and resistance. It's going around this sort of stable line around the $40,000 mark. And for many people, they're saying, well, why isn't it moving? And I say, hang on a second. When it was pumping, it was a scam. When it was falling, it was a scam. And now that it's actually acting like it should be, that is getting a lot of consistency and stability in it, because we can see over time, the more money comes into the market, the more stable it becomes. Sure, it's moving much faster than property and gold and so forth, but it doesn't have the volatility of the past. So when I see it acting stable, I'm actually quite happy with that. I can see that this channel, so if you were a swing trader, and if you haven't read my book, 28 Pro Trader Tips the Art of Trading, I talk about traders trading within a channel. And at the moment, if you were trading within a channel of $38,000 to around $42,000, you could quite easily and comfortably trade within that channel. And if you were a risk taker, you'd put some leverage upon that to get bigger effects. But you really don't need to. No matter which way we approach this, there are people who buy this differently. Of course, they trade it, they swing trade it, they buy the bottom, sell the top, or they short the position, they buy the top and sell the bottom after shorting the position. But over and over and over again, Martin, we consistently see that if you just put in $10 a week, $20 a week, $100 a week, whatever your budget is, and you dollar cost average in, you invest only what you can afford to lose, over time, I can't read the future, but it almost seems impossible to lose. Of all the investments I've made in my life, stock exchange, precious metals, property, lots of property, this one has outperformed all of them. And the more I get into this space, the more I realize that fiat is completely dead. And we can see that with the money printing going on. And I've spoken to you in previous videos about, I believe, war is coming. That has kind of come to fruition. And I think, as we can see when we'll probably get into this a bit later, but we can see that with many of the sanctions around the world. What's ironic to me is that, we're in a very fragile position in the world at the moment, where we have a superpower picking on someone smaller, and we have another superpower, the United States, funding that through the purchase of oil from Russia. And it is absolutely amazing to see that all these sanctions will be put in place, but still the US dollar and euros continue to go to Russia to fund this war machine. And I really wonder, is all of this about money? And if it is, I've often said that fiat is a money of war, whilst Bitcoin is a money of peace.
Profound thought there, Adam. I want to share with you this slide, right? This is actually not another crypto. It's actually the natural gas futures. Right. I just wanted to highlight that, there are other assets doing stupid things as well, right? Going way up and all over the place, right? So it's not like we should assume that the rest of the financial markets are somehow, behaving differently, right? There are other commodities, there are other elements doing quite similar things. which I think is a very important warning to people, because everybody sort of ring-fenced Bitcoin and said, oh, it's over there, it's completely different. There are some behaviours that we're seeing elsewhere in our financial system, which are, as adverse and as difficult to try and work out. And, the natural gas futures is probably the one that's most significant because, of course, what's happening with Russia. And in fact, Cookie Boy asked a question earlier on, which I'll put it now. If Russia shuts its internet down or limits its use, will crypto be affected? And maybe we can use that as a way into the broader conversation about Russia, because there was quite a lot of speculation early on when those sanctions started to be spoken about that maybe a lot of money will be transferred into Bitcoin and other cryptos in Russia. And I'm not sure what the story is, or whether you've got any thoughts as to how true that is or how false that is, or what's going on vis-a-vis crypto and Russia, but it will be good to unpack that a bit.
It's a really good question. I'm glad you raised it. So in the first instance, yes, if we shut down all internet and radio waves, there's no access to the blockchain. But the counter to that is we can see that Russia is also using the blockchain. So Russia's been stockpiling gold and Bitcoin for many years. And what is interesting is on the day of the invasion, about 6 hours after the actual invasion, the price of Bitcoin jumped up significantly. If you look at the daily candle, it's really inconsistent. So you have quite a tight channel where it's going across and tracking sideways. And then several hours after the invasion, boom, this candle just took off, which showed that a lot of people were trying to put their money somewhere. Now, I'm actually going to go to Iran as an example. When people were fleeing Iran from a previous conflict, many of them were putting their money into Bitcoin so they could move their money in and out of the country. They couldn't put it into gold because it's too heavy. They couldn't put it through the SWIFT network because it would have been sanctioned. And they couldn't put it into US dollars because it's bags of cash. And when you're flying, there's only $10,000 that you can take with you. So many people were moving value around the world via the blockchain. And now that we can see what's happening in America and in Russia, let's say Russia shuts down its internet. Well, I doubt they do it to themselves, but I think the question was more, what if we shut down the internet on them? Well, Russia has its own servers. Russia has its own access to its own internet per se, which plugs into the broader internet. Then you've got VPNs to add on top of that. It's almost impossible to shut a first world nation such as Russia out of the internet. And as a result, it's really difficult to shut them out of the financial systems. So this is when we go back to the SWIFT network. So now you look at the SWIFT network and the same rule applies. Technically, if we wanted to shut Russia out of the financial system, you could flip the switch and say, for A, sanctions, so you can't move money around. B, we're not going to allow anyone to move anything to or from Russia through the SWIFT network. But C, we could flick off the switch to say any transactions through the blockchain are also not to go through there. Now, there is one coin in particular that I mentioned, will mention now, that pumped also during the recent campaign. And that is, over the last 7 days, one of the biggest movers is a coin called Monero with a code of XMR. Now, the reason why Monero is a very powerful coin, to the extent that the Australian government stopped Australians trading it on the crypto exchanges here. So in the past, I could legally buy XMR on CoinSpot as an example, but you can't do that now. And the reason why you can't do that is because it is the true privacy coin. It is a privacy coin that people can move from party A to party B, and you can't track it. And this becomes a very powerful tool, which goes into, is access to your money a human right? So this is where I like working with you, Martin, because you've got your philosophical side. And I've really gone into deep thought experiments about this. If we sanction a government, fair enough. It's one government one government to another government saying, we don't like what you're doing, so we're putting sanctions on you. Got it. But when we extend those sanctions to the people and we say, right, Russian citizens, you're not the government, you're not the military, but we're stopping you spending your money. Well, now that Russian citizen can't buy bread or milk or pay for their rent or maybe insulin if they need it, are we encroaching on their human rights? Now, human rights, the term in itself is quite subjective, the way we look at it. But as we can see, if I put on my military uniform as example, if I engage into aggressive acts against a civilian or a citizen of a nation, even if they are the enemy, that's against the Geneva Convention, and I can't attack civilians or citizens, even if they are of the foreign nation or the enemy of which we are fighting. Yet we can see now that some sanctions are being applied onto citizens, civilians, who are not combatants, who can't vote out their government because they're a communist nation, and who have no control over what their government does. Yet we're treating these people as if they were the enemy. So it actually, and I don't have the answer to this, it just raises a lot of philosophical and moral questions in my mind. It's one thing to sanction a government, but is it right to sanction the citizen so they can no longer buy their bread?
Well, and it raises some very, very interesting philosophical questions, right? Because, of course, if you take Ukraine as an example, we know that a lot of the bombardments that have been going on are actually hitting citizens, not the military, right? So that's an example where collateral damage is being done to people who are just innocently wanting to go about their business but can't, right? And I wonder whether that's a mirror image to what you're talking about with regard to the, the sanctions applied to Russia is going to spill over to ordinary people. And that's always the problem. It's the collateral damage that's done beyond what might want to be done. And it's interesting.
I touched on that, if I may, and you're right. We want these citizens, these civilians, to be safe. But now we go into the fog of war. And we saw, and we can only see what we can see on the news, where the Ukrainian government was handing out machine guns to civilians. Now, once that civilian has a machine gun in their hand, is firing at the enemy, are they now a non-combatant or are they a combatant? Now, technically, I would suggest that if someone has a machine gun and they're shooting at you, they become a combatant. Now, of course, they're doing the right thing in the sense that they're defending their nation, they're defending their country, they're defending their families. But in laws of armed conflict, you can't arm your citizens. So I can't imagine Australia ever doing that. I can't imagine Australia going out and saying, I won't mention the nation, but you probably know which one I'm talking about. That big nation is coming in to attack us. Everyone take a machine gun. Well, that kind of crosses over from those non-combatants now being combatants. But I do acknowledge most certainly there is a lot of collateral damage happening, and we want to avoid that collateral damage. And it's most certainly part of war when you're going into these campaigns. And I certainly remember on one of my operations, there are areas where you can't attack, for example, a mosque or a church. This is a sacred place, and it's against many conventions to shoot upon those areas or to have any type of aggressive force against them. But what happens when the enemy uses those places as cover and start firing from a mosque onto your people? Do you have a right to now flatten that mosque? And it's not so black and white. And that is why war is just an absolute mess. And we hope that all of this is resolved.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I certainly am of the view that once the cat's out of the bag, it's very hard to put it back in the bag. And lots of collateral damage and lots of innocent people get hurt. And frankly, it's a significant failure over a long period of time. I would argue that the policy missteps that have been taken on both sides, both within and around Russia and also more broadly, have been going on for many years. And this hasn't just suddenly popped out from nowhere, right? This was actually always going to build because of the way that things were played. So unfortunately, the failure of diplomacy and the failure of leadership has brought us to this point. Shame on those who actually let it happen, because I
agree with you entirely, Martin. I absolutely agree with you entirely. And I also say that, historically, I've been mentioning on my videos for many years, I said war is coming, and war has most certainly been coming. And I unfortunately cannot see this being resolved at the lowest level. I can only see this escalating further and further and further, because you're dead right. The cat's been let out of the bag. We can't put it back now. And I also say this about Putin. Now, is he evil? Probably. Looks like what he's doing is very evil. But is he stupid? Well, I think that's too easy to say that. I think it's very convenient to say he's dumb and crazy. Well, look at what he's achieved. I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying it's horrific. But dumb people can't achieve what he's done. He has somehow managed to lead his country, who's now been ostracized by the rest of the world, and rightfully so, one way or another, to invade a smaller country. Now, there are some arguments that Ukraine, and I can't substantiate this, but there's arguments that Ukraine has a very checkered past itself, with allegedly being the center of human trafficking and pedophile rings and chemical biological development labs there sponsored by the United States. I can't substantiate any of that. But what I can substantiate is that Ukraine was not accepted into NATO. And we have to ask ourselves, why wasn't it accepted into NATO? It wanted to be into NATO. And even now, NATO won't accept it into it. And we have to ask ourselves, why didn't NATO accept Ukraine? And I don't have the answer to that.
No, I suspect it's something along the lines of that if, in fact, Ukraine had been brought into NATO, that would have then been precipitating an even greater conflict, because by definition, Russia would have seen the West knocking right on their door, right? And those sorts of barrier countries have formed a little bit of insulation between NATO and Russia. That's the part of the underlying pressure that we got here, which is why
our minds think alike, because last week I released a video exactly on that. So when I lived in South Korea, I visited the DMZ of between North and South Korea several times. I've been there in and out of uniform, and that buffer is very convenient for both China and the West. That is, North Korea is a land buffer between these two countries, and I really see Ukraine exactly the same way. If you didn't have Ukraine there, you've essentially got Russia on the footsteps of Europe and NATO on the footsteps of Russia.
Yep.
And I don't think either party wants that. And I get why they don't want that. Now, unfortunately for Ukraine, they become this buffer. And my prediction is this, Martin. My prediction is we're going to have another repeat similar to the Korean War. That is, if you recall the history behind the Korean War, we had the North pushing South and the South pushing North, and it went back and forth. And in the end, they said, look, we can't win. It's a stalemate. Now, the Korean War is still actually going. There has not been a peace treaty. It's only a ceasefire. It is the longest ceasefire in modern history that we know of. But the DMZ is most certainly still a very active zone. And a little interesting fact is that this 4-kilometre demilitarized zone that goes along the 38th parallel across the Korean Peninsula has now by default become one of the greatest nature reserves in the world, because no one ever goes in there. It is sprinkled with landmines, so every now and then you get the occasional deer that goes up in many pieces. But ultimately, no, people go, random facts. I've got lots of random facts. But when we go to Ukraine, I see something similar there, where you're going to have potentially this war where it's going to be pushing east and west, and eventually they're going to have a demilitarized zone that says, right, let's just make a divide here. Russia, you stay on that side. NATO, you stay on that side, and probably have another 50-year ceasefire. I don't know.
No, but it's how you get there, of course, which is the interesting question. Well, we'll move on from talking about some of those conflicts and politics. Ray asked quite an interesting question back on the peer-to-peer transfer system. Is Layer 2 just a peer-to-peer transfer system? You're talking there about the difference between Layer 1 and Layer 2 in terms of the digital payments. So is it a peer-to-peer transfer system that you're talking about, or is it something different?
Yeah, I mean, technically you've got atomic swaps. So if you and I wanted to sell with each other, and I didn't want, there's several ways I do it. I mean, I can give a real life example. Someone wanted to sell me a car recently, and they said, I'll take Ethereum for it. So that is an example of a peer-to-peer swap where they give me a car and I give them Ethereum. Now, that deal didn't go through. The other way to do it is if we're not actually going to buy cars or goods and services, we can do an atomic swap, but those atomic swaps, they do need the internet to occur. So ultimately, one way or another, these Layer 2 solutions, they do require the internet one way or another to move these transactions through. One other way to do it is that you can see that, in fact, the example that we gave with the one of my subscribers who wanted to buy something from IGA. Now, it's very cumbersome, but they were community banding together. They knew that the internet was down. They could see the situation. And the shopkeeper took it upon himself to essentially accept IOUs. So he gave out the milk. They said, I owe you $3 for this bottle of milk. I'll pay you when the internet comes back on, or I get access to cash. Now, that is a very crude example of a Layer 2 solution, but it is still a way of moving value from party A to party B without the internet standing, which is why I go back to, we don't need one money. Well, I'm a big believer in more than one money. We don't have to have just Bitcoin. We can have Bitcoin and cash.
Absolutely. Well, let's go on to talk about Canada. And in fact, Ray threw this question, which is a nice way into it. Will the Canadian experience leave people in doubt crypto going forward when the government can shut it down on a person-by-person basis? And just to talk about that for a bit more broadly, they basically brought in legislation which froze a whole bunch of crypto accounts and other accounts too, by the way, in response to the demonstrations that were going on in Ottawa and elsewhere. And frankly, this whole story of what Canada did and the interventions that they made to essentially fiddle and control the financial system is pretty shocking.
Yeah, I actually think it's appalling. But I don't want to sort of lean too much on what my opinions of the Canadian government and what they did. But ultimately, yes, they did shut down access to some crypto wallets. But what's very interesting about that is that they could only shut down wallets on exchanges. So I told you before that if you're transacting in Bitcoin, there is a digital trail where you can see where the Bitcoin has gone. That is gone from this wallet to that wallet. But what actually happened when Canada shut down that movement of crypto is that they went to the exchanges and they said, anyone who's got money on this exchange and within your wallets, we don't permit you to move this money around. Now, it almost became a meme, but it was a real letter. One of the exchanges said, we don't hold the keys to any of our people's money. It is their money. Therefore, we can't enact your order because we can't control this money. But then quite funnily at the end, they said, but please reach out to us when the Canadian dollar collapses and we'll be here to help you to build the future of your economy. And it was an official letter to the Canadian government to say, hey, we've got no control over this money, but when your fiat collapses, we'll help you out with the future of money. So in the first instance, their control was actually quite limited on what they could do. In the second instance, if we go back to that coin, the privacy coin of Monero, they could never have touched that. They could never have seen it nor touched it. But what makes me think about what Canada did is that we can see that banks are really acting as agents to the government. And it takes away a lot of the old-fashioned policing of, the argument I give is that we see many people who are bad people, like terrorists as an example. They wear shoes and drive cars, but we don't ban shoes and cars because terrorists can use them. We have to apply policing to those models. And what I'm concerned about when we certainly go to the CBDC, which I do think will come in, is that in the future, if we have a central bank digital currency, in the example that you're asking with Canada, they would not have had to approach the exchanges and say, hey, exchanges, shut down all those wallets. The CBDC, the government itself, could just burn that money, literally digitally burn that money to say, hey, Martin, that $10,000 you had, we're not blocking it, we're burning it. Therefore, that money is gone forever. And that is greatly alarming to me because on one hand, the CBDC is very efficient. It's like the internet of money. It becomes more efficient and makes sense. If you look at welfare recipients as an example, we want to give our welfare recipients support so they can buy food, water, shelter, but we don't necessarily want them to buy drugs and alcohol and cigarettes. So a CBDC in that instance would be very good because you could program that money just as you could with a food voucher and say, this is only good for food, water, shelter. It's not good for bad stuff. But of course, the libertarians would say, well, can't they buy some bad stuff? Can't they buy a bottle of beer at night? And it goes back to the fundamental question. Is access to your money a human right? We know access to medical treatment in first world countries is a human right. We know access to food, water, and shelter, even if you're the worst criminal in these countries, is your human right. But here we can see protesters have had access to their money taken away. Now, that access to that money could have and would have bought them food, water, and shelter. So this is where I get morally conflicted. When governments put a blanket ban on money and these people can no longer buy food, water, shelter, is the government now a democratic government or is it a tyranny?
Well, there was a very interesting question that came in. SWIFT removal plus banking apartheid plus government direction equals fascism. Coming to the rest of us, what are your thoughts? And that is, of course, the point, isn't it? Because essentially there are entities in positions of power or who would desire to be in positions of power who want to control more and effectively direct more. And I think central bank digital currencies is in fact one of those really dangerous weapons because, as you say, it allows you to manipulate and control. That's one of the reasons why, of course, in China, the digital yuan is now taking off and is becoming a very important part and linked to the social scores. So suddenly, if you are doing good things, you can continue to spend your money. But if you're not doing good things, suddenly your social scores, means you can't actually access the funds anymore, which means that they have complete control, effectively. And there are, unfortunately, some people who believe that they know best and they actually want to impose their particular will on society, and their values becomes the values of society, and they impose those things. And my perspective is that central bank digital currency is a tool of control and a tool potentially of authoritarianism, and that's why I'm quite concerned.
I think the Huntsman has summarised that perfectly. Well done. I agree with exactly what you said, Martin. I'm concerned that it is an authoritarian way of controlling the people, well beyond what we've got at the moment. And once we start shutting down debate, as we saw in Canada, now I know there's more to it than just debate, but if you compare to how BLM was treated, I mean, BLM, those protests, they were violent, buildings were burnt down and people were killed, and they were nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize and given donations. Yet you have a bunch of truckers on jumping castles, waving flags and singing their national anthem, and that they are called fascists and white supremacists and racists and Nazis. I mean, it is absolutely absurd. And then we shut down their money. So if you add a CBDC to that, you're just giving governments even more control. Now, the good news, Martin, is, I think about 2 or 3 episodes ago when we spoke about this, you said, I put it to you that the government will put forward a CBDC. You said governments will do it. And I agreed with you. I said, yes, it will happen. But I took it a step further, if you recall, and I said, just because China makes their people use their digital yuan, they can't make me use it. And what do I mean by that? Sure, when I'm in China, if I'm ever in China, I've got to use their digital money. But if I've got a shipping container of Australian beef, probably not a shipping container, a refrigerated container of Australian beef, and they say, Adam, I'm going to give you 100,000 digital yuan to buy your beef. And I'm like, well, I'm not sure if that's a good deal. But Brazil, who is adopting Bitcoin, or we'll go with El Salvador, who has adopted Bitcoin, they say, Adam, I'll give you 3 Bitcoin. Well, of course I'm going to take the 3 Bitcoin. I'm going to take the 3 Bitcoin because no one can print more of it. No one can block it. No one can deprogram it. No one can seize it. No one can dilute it. So on the global stage, the reality is, Martin, is that this global reserve will be Bitcoin. It could be gold, but we're just going to write notes against it. We can't move gold around. And remember, the power of Bitcoin is that the transaction is the verification. If I send you a block of gold, first of all, it's going to take a long time to do it. But when you get a block of gold rocking up at your doorstep, you have to weigh it, you have to test it, and then you have to store it. But if you want that same transaction in Bitcoin, the transaction is the verification. And noting that we can now move money around the world much faster through Bitcoin, the real question is, will the global market want your money? As in, will they want America's CBDC or Australia's CBDC or Canada's CBDC? Or will they want Bitcoin? And to me, it's blindingly obvious. I want Bitcoin because it's scarce.
Absolutely. Well, when you put it like that, there's some interesting contrast, right? And of course, we know in Australia now, the Reserve Bank, up till about 6 months ago, was saying there was no room in Australia for a retail central bank digital currency. They were putting all of their eggs in the commercial central bank digital currency, facilitating the movement of money at a commercial level, right? Then there was this government report that came out some little while ago that said, no, you actually should be thinking about a central bank digital currency. The Treasury is now actively investigating how that could be implemented, right? The other point to make is that there is a line of argument that says when the recession, which I think is coming, and I think that the war is going to create this probably even more dramatically than previously expected, you'll have to take interest rates lower. We are close to zero now with interest rates, which means you've got to go negative. You can't go to negative interest rates while people can still move money out of banks and move it and hold it as notes. The only way you can do that is if you can impose a negative interest rate on the banking system. The only way you can do that is to make it digital, because then you can control it and go negative. In other words, a central bank digital currency, negative interest rates, and financial repression are all aligned. And that's the unfortunate story that nobody will want to talk about, but for me is the thing we should be thinking about very carefully when it comes to central bank digital currencies. And that's why the alternative of the crypto environment, which is less controlled, and less easy to get your arms around, as it were, is an alternative. But of course you've got to understand that central banks will say, well, hang on a moment, well, we're going to find excuses as to why crypto can't be allowed to continue because, of course, it's beyond our control. We have to get our arms around it. They're talking about regulation of crypto. They're talking about all sorts of things to try and get their tentacles around that too. So that's what I see as the contention ahead.
It's interesting you mentioned the interest rate, because Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, holding a meeting this month, 15th of March, and it's forecasted that he's going to raise the interest rates by 25 basis points, but we can't afford to do that at the moment. Now, we saw that their latest report said that inflation in the States was around 7.5%. Now, that is a very, very conservative estimate. I forecast that it's actually around 20%, and I can give you an example. First of all, think about energy prices. So you showed that chart at the beginning of our discussion today where you said, hey, look, this is the natural gas futures, and look how much it's going up. Now, energy is a huge expense, one of the greatest expenses that we have as a society globally. It's all about energy, and some argue that even this war is about energy. The other one, of course, is money, so money and energy. But then we can see real estate going up as well. So we have this massive run-up of huge expenses. Is it because it's harder to get, or is it because of inflation, or is it because it's both? And I think it's like you said, they're all kind of lining up together to make the perfect storm. If you look at the Swiss cheese model, all the holes are lining up to make it this disaster that we're facing at the moment. And at a time that we, in fact, need to be lowering interest rates. Well, we've already exhausted that economic lever. We've pushed that economic lever all the way to arguably zero. And I argue we're already at zero because when you count for inflation,
yep,
we're in
real terms. Yep,
that's right.
Yep.
We are in negative interest rates at the moment. And I'm a quick little side story. I'm working with my architect at the moment to build a house, and he's a very good architect. And I mentioned him because if you get a good architect, it's not just about drawing a picture, it's about drawing a design to meet with the regulations. But if you have a really good architect, he can draw you a design to meet with the regulations of your city, your town, your council, but also he can forecast the costs. So what he's discovered is that he's been working on all of these designs for the last year or so. He's met the budget of his customer. The customer said, I want to build a new house for $1 million. So, all right, here's your design, here's the regulations, we've got it, we agree, done. Well, guess what? All the buildings gone up by 40%. Not just the lumber, not just the steel, but the labor. And here we have government saying that inflation's at 7.5%. No, it's not. It's well beyond that. Yeah. And we can see that because in real life, I mean, I've got a genuine question for you. Have you ever seen a used car market go up in expense? I've never seen it in my life. Have you seen it in your life?
Yes, I have, years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, years ago.
And what was happening?
Well, that was because that was when inflation was very high and oil prices were very high, and essentially what that meant was that people couldn't afford to buy new, so they bought secondhand, so secondhand prices went up. The cost of manufacturing was rising very fast, so the price of new was rising very quickly. And that was in the days when you had current price accounting. So you actually had accounting that allowed for inflation. So when you reported your annual results, you adjusted them for the rate of inflation.
Powerful. Well, I recently read a very confronting piece that they said, it's always concerning to me when I create my theories, I put them forward, and then someone smarter than me who I haven't heard before, they actually repeat my own theory to me, and I'm like, oh no, I really wanted to be wrong on that. And in this one article, they were saying that right now you should in fact be buying a lot of everything that you need. And when I say everything you need, I mean not big screen TVs and so forth, or unless you really need that, but I'm talking like, soap, dental floss, toilet paper, all the basic stuff that you're going to need, because he said a lot of this stuff is about to go through the roof. Yep. And then he took it a step further and he said, not only is it about to go through the roof, but in fact, in many instances, you're not going to be able to get it anymore. Yep. So I test drove a new M5 the other day, and the car, we know what car salesman's like, no disrespect to you good car salesmen out there, but he was basically saying, if you don't get this car now, as in this display model, all of these features won't be available on it next year. And I'm like, yeah, right. And he's like, no, I'm serious. He goes, we can't get these chips. We can't get this part. So there's these brand new cars, even when cost. I mean, the car I was driving, or test driving, was a $255,000 car. And they were saying, all of these things that you want in the car, they're not going to be available next year because we simply can't get those parts in. So that was actually an example of, even when you've got all the money in the world, it doesn't matter. If they can't produce the stuff, you've got inflation going through the roof. So the battler's going to be really hurt. And even if the battler's not coming into this equation, which we should consider, the privileged per se can't get what they want because this stuff is just simply not available anymore.
Well, what happens is, and this is back to the 70s and 80s, I mean, I lived through that. I lived through the very high inflationary situation. And one of the things is you buy more now because you know that next week it's going to be more expensive, right? A lot more expensive, right? If you can get it. And the fact is that supply chains, if they get disrupted, it means it's going to be more difficult to get stuff, which means that you're going to see even higher price rises. I mean, if you think about the east coast of Australia and all of the supply chain disruption that's now there, vegetables, fruit are going to be a lot higher in price in the next month, 2 months, 3 months, right? It's quite clear. And interestingly, on my surveys, when I talk to people about their real lived experience of the cost of living, they're not saying it's 3%. They're saying it's 8, 9, 10% or more.
Yeah.
And look at fuel. You know, first time ever, I filled up the car the other day. It was more than $100. I've never put $100 worth of fuel in my vehicle at one point until now.
And that's just the standard.
Yeah. And I just want to show you this one. This is actually, it's not another crypto. It's wheat futures. This is US wheat futures, right? So you can see there, right, it's gone up from, it was dodging around the 700 to 800, right? And it's now up at 1360, right? And this one here is corn futures, right, which is pretty much doing the same, although it was a bit higher earlier on. I mean, these are really, really big movements. And what it shows you is that, there's a lot of action. And if we just look at the crude oil, this is WTI crude, 121.92 at the moment. These are huge moves. So we are going to see considerable rises in terms of the price of everything, right? And whilst the Federal Reserve and other people were talking about transitory inflation, well, this is now wired in. And by the way, going back to our Russia conversation, if they decide to not use Russian oil anymore, then prices will go even higher. I was listening to somebody from the UK today saying that the costs of heating and fuel are like to double over the next year or so.
Absolutely. So they're currently paying around, it depends where you are, but on average around $5 per gallon, US dollars per gallon. And you're dead right. If they cut off that supply to Russia, and you can see the method, this goes back to the poor policies they've made, the poor leadership. And again, going back to Putin, you might want to say he's dumb. Well, I don't think he's dumb. I think he forecasted all of this. I think he war gamed all of it and said, if I do this, this is going to happen. If I do that, this is going to happen. I mean, it's the most basics of military command. Anything you do, you war game at the tactical, strategic, or operational level. You war game to see what happens. And you can see now that the West is backed into a corner. Now, what's very fascinating about those charts, and I really appreciate you bringing them up, is that it's a double fold. What I'm seeing from those charts is I'm seeing, sure, that stock, that commodity, that food is going up in value, but of course, what it's pegged to is also going up. So it's a seesaw. The demand is going up, as in the price of it is going up because there's such a high demand for it with the supply dropping. But equally, what we're comparing it to, dollars, is crashing. So it's going to shoot up. Now, Bitcoin's doing it, oil's doing it, everything's doing it except for the US dollar itself. Do you recall how Venezuela was protecting themselves from that crazy inflation?
Yeah, doing some of the same things we're doing now, right?
Well, yeah, and one of the big things that they were doing there is that they were actually mothballing white goods. So they were buying fridges, washing machines, and stuff that they knew someone would need in the future. Because once they got to the point of, I've bought all this stuff, like, where do you put your money? They couldn't put it in dollars because of the sanctions. They couldn't put it in gold because of the sanctions. And when I say sanctions, it was sanctions on their own people, as in their own president was saying, well, you can't take the money out of the economy, which makes sense. We can't sell you gold because we need you to prop up this money that we're printing out of thin air. So the people just took it upon themselves. And this is what was so ironic, is that us in the first world, who we believe were educated, we went to university, we got an economics degree, and yet here we have second and third world countries who get it better than us. They get it better than us because they understand that the loaf of bread this morning is $1, and by tomorrow afternoon, it's going to be $130. That is hyperinflation.
Yep.
We are not in transitory inflation. That is an absolute lie by any government who states we are in transitory inflation. This is the reality of fiat. Fiat operates in market failure. Fiat is the greatest Ponzi scheme in the history of humanity. And the irony about people who call Bitcoin a Ponzi scheme, they're the ones who are embracing the actual Ponzi scheme, which is fiat. They just keep printing it and printing it and printing it. And no fiat has ever lasted. It doesn't matter what color you are, what language you speak, what flag you fly, it doesn't matter. Mathematics is blind. Mathematics doesn't care about who you are, what you look like. It is just the rule of the universe. And if you want to put the United States on your fiat note, or Zimbabwe on your fiat note, or Australia on your fiat note, it doesn't matter. It's all fake and it's all collapsing. And in my opinion, I genuinely believe the answer is Bitcoin. And this is my forecast as well. The thing about doing these videos is I put it out there and it's out there forever. So if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I think this is what's going to happen. And now I hope I'm wrong about this. I think that we're going to see war kick off. I think we're going to go into a 3 or 4 year campaign. I think we're going to see massive loss of life and infrastructure. And then I think we're going to end up in a stalemate where you're going to have the world powers sitting around a table, figuratively or literally with the red button, the nuke button in front of them. You're going to have China, India, Pakistan, Russia, England, Iran, and maybe someone else. And no one is going to want to let up or give the other person the power to be the global reserve currency. America wants to be the global reserve currency because they are the global reserve currency. But so does China, and so does Russia, and so does India, and so does everyone. Everyone wants to be the global reserve currency. If you could be the global reserve currency and print it, why wouldn't you? So once they get to this stalemate, I think this is what will happen. They'll say, right, we all agree to disagree. I'm not going to let America be the reserve currency or the Chinese yuan or Russia or India or Iran. So let's meet halfway. Let's meet with Bitcoin. No one can print it. No one can stop it. No one can corrupt it. No one can have a leg up on us. So we'll agree with that. But here's the thing. Russia's been stockpiling Bitcoin whilst America has not. China and Russia are net importers of gold. And China doesn't export any of its gold. Essentially, it basically pulls all of its gold out of the ground, stockpiles it, and then even buys other people's gold and stockpiles it. So if we go to a gold standard again, well, I think we're setting ourselves up for fiat because it goes back to that thing. We're going to put gold in a safe, we're going to write a banknote against it, and then someone's going to corrupt it and write 2 or 3 banknotes against it. So we're just back to fiat. But if we go to Bitcoin, no one can print against it. That is, they can't put 2 banknotes against it. They can't double own it unless we get into those futures market, which is why I think the futures market and spot back or paperback ETFs will ultimately fail. So strategically, I think that the West has been very slow to act on Bitcoin, but I don't think China and Russia have been. I think China have actually saying, you know what, there could be something in this Bitcoin, so we're going to stockpile some of it. And if you look at this as a risk assessment, so if you do a risk assessment in money, in business, in safety, whatever it is, you look at the likelihood versus the consequence. Like, what is the likelihood this is going to happen? And what is the consequence if it does happen? And you put those two together and that will give you a risk score. So let's go into a real life example of wearing a seatbelt. What is the likelihood that you're going to have a car crash? Well, it's pretty low. Overall, the likelihood of having a car crash is pretty low. But what's the consequence? Well, the consequence can be absolutely catastrophic. That's why every time you get in a car, you put on your seatbelt, because likelihood low, consequence catastrophic, risk score high. Now we go into the financial space. What is the likelihood that Bitcoin will be the global reserve currency of the world? Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask me, I think it's going to be very likely. If you ask Peter Schiff, he'll say there's no chance at all. Fine. But what's the consequence? What's the consequence of an economy not holding any Bitcoin and it suddenly becomes a global reserve currency? We argue in the crypto land that, in fact, a small country such as El Salvador, who's been adopting this currency as a first mover and now starting to stockpile it, we, in fact, could hypothetically see a shift where these very small countries who are adopting the future of money early will have a massive pivoting on the global reserve stage, on the global financial stage, because they got in early. And I can't see why our governments aren't, just to hedge their bets, just to be safe, just to do your risk score. You know what? Let's put $1 billion into this Bitcoin. But here's the thing. Martin, as soon as all the countries start catching on to this, so China's been doing it in the background, Russia's been doing it in the background, some say India's been doing it in the background. Once countries start announcing that, hey, we're hedging our bets, we're putting $10 billion into Bitcoin, then bang, all the countries are going to do it because they have to do it. It's the same as a military. Why do we have a military? Well, we have to have a military because our adversaries have a military. It doesn't mean that we support war by having militaries. It just means that the risk assessment is you must spend billions and billions of dollars on militaries just in case. And the same is now trickling over, in my opinion, into the financial space. Economies are going to start to wake up and say, you know what? We can't risk it. We can see that the US dollar is collapsing. We know it's a law of the universe. We have to invest in Bitcoin.
So just on the US dollar, the DXY at the moment is at 99.15, right? It's the strongest it's been for a long, long time. One of the reasons why the exchange rate moved, because of course people are going back to the US dollar as a safe haven, which is quite interesting, right? And of course the other one that people are looking at also is gold, that's now actually got above 2009 at the moment. So that's the highest it's been for quite a little while. So you can.
Are those numbers? Are they nominal amounts or real amounts?
So these are real current prices. So it's not inflation adjusted.
See, I'd love to see that chart, inflation adjusted.
Yeah,
but you know what I mean, because we just can't read that. We generally can't read that without it being inflation adjusted.
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree. But then, of course, well, which inflation do you use? Because, as we've argued, the real inflation is not the same as...
Well said. Yep.
Yeah. So it is interesting. I guess the other point, which I wanted to just sort of bring the conversation forward to, right? There's this question of digital identity, right? If you go back to Canada and what they did, digital identity and the future of money is a very important link, right? Because there will be powerful people who want to be able to track and measure and control. And therefore, if you have digital identity and tie it to your digital money, they've got all the pieces to be able to control, right? And I think this is another debate that we're not having adequately, right? That, I'll give you a very simple example. The ABC is now forcing people to sign up and log in when they use the iView app, right? Now that sounds very simple, right? Because what it means is that you can then move it from one platform to another platform, and you can pick up what and they can make you suggestions. So at one level, sounds perfectly reasonable, but they know what you watch. Now, am I comfortable with that? Right? And then if you start thinking about other digital identities, your tax identity and your banking identity and digital money, there is this sort of big brothery type thing there in the background, which I worry about, because it seems to me that all of the DNA of a controlling, could I say manipulating, force could actually develop. And if it did, that could have a very profound effect on society, a very profound effect on who can do what and all sorts of things like that. Now, overlay that, to what extent is crypto an antidote to that sort of centralized control? Or have we actually fallen into this trap with know your customer and the other things and the other regulations that are coming in, that effectively Bitcoin and other cryptos are being pulled into the same digital domain, so effectively they will be identified and connected to individuals as well?
This is really powerful stuff, and some argue that it actually goes back to the international campaign against terrorism. Let's face it, any time that they want to control your money, it's about anti-money laundering. It's all about terrorism. And I've probably triggered the YouTube algorithm just by saying that 3 times in a row. But that is the ultimate excuse. The ultimate excuse of any government anywhere is to say, we need to be able to control you and your money to make sure that the bad people aren't doing anything bad. Now, it kind of shows us that in history, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we can see that throughout history, in any country, in any time, what typically happens is governments start off as a service for the people, and then it kind of evolves into controlling the people. And then you have an uprising of the people, and we have, if you will, a great reset. We have a great reset where the people eventually overthrow the government. We might go to an example of Rome or the Boston Tea Party or the Eureka Stockade, even as an example within Australia, even with our limited history, when governments will keep doing what they can get away with. And one of the arguments is that they'll go a little bit further, they'll take a few steps forward and then take one step back, or they'll hold you really tight, they'll grab you by the throat and squeeze, and then just when you think that you can't take it anymore, they'll release you. And it's like, oh, my government is kind because now I can go outside without a mask. Now I can actually go to the bar without a digital identity to swipe in with a QR code. So we can see this progression of holding us really tight, then letting us go a little bit. But every law that they put in place, Martin, they never repeal. When was the last time you heard of a law being repealed? I mean, we just keep putting more and more and more laws in.
It's like the toll on the Harbour Bridge. That was meant to be temporary, right?
That's right. Well, great point. Everything was actually meant to be temporary. So if we look at everything that was going to go...
Actually, income tax originally was temporary. It was designed some centuries ago to fund a particular war. It's just they forgot to take it away again.
Well, delinking the gold standard was meant to be temporary. I wasn't even alive. But in 1971, Nixon said, I'm temporarily delinking the US dollar from the gold reserve standard. That was in 1971. We're over half a century later, and when have they put it back to the gold standard? So my point is, we can see that these governments, and all governments, I'm not having a go at any government, it's almost like a human instinct or a human behavior where absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we know how to sort of encroach our power onto the people step by step. And then we essentially reach, I would argue, homeostasis, where nature kind of balances itself, where if you look at the core of nature, you can have an environmental disaster where everything is ruined, but eventually nature will kind of get back to its natural balance. And if we bring this over to the financial, human and political space, we can see that when people are pushed to the point of rising in the streets, well, the government can do one of two things. They can back off or they can wind it up. And why Canada was an interesting case study is because it was a democratic nation that didn't back off. They wound it up. They enacted the Emergencies Act. And then we've got that horrific scenes of police on horses trampling old ladies with walking frames who were standing in the snow, protesting, or they thought, exercising their democratic right. So and then, of course, the core of all of this is arguably money. And this is why, my friend, I am so passionate about Bitcoin. It's because the more I learn about it, the more I realize it is the epitome of democracy. It is the fundamentals of everything we do in democracy. Why? Because I don't need a centralized third party to control or print my money. I can actually have sovereign ownership of my money controlled by me, not by a bank, not by a government, but by me. And governments, I mean, let's face it, governments are elected by us. We really have to ask ourselves as a society, do we want the government to control us? And is it fair for a government to say, I'm treating you all like terrorists because one of you could be a terrorist? I remember when I was in command of one unit in particular, I won't say which one it was, but one of the things with the military is we often do group punishment. And the reason why we do group punishment is because it ensures that you're looking out for your mates. So if one person's late to turn up to something, you say, right, we're all going to stay back half an hour to make up for that one person being late. Now, on one hand, it's in the modern era that's looked at kind of bullying because now you're singling out this person. But in the traditional sense, it created a sense of community and everyone looked after each other. Even if someone was dragged behind, you'd pull them along, because if we don't have them along with us, we're all going to hurt. Now, we've kind of applied that to society, but instead of making us, if you will, a team, we're now so divided. We're now so divided that we don't have the strength in numbers to stand up to tyranny and to what is arguably very bad in our society. Let's think about all the division we have. We have the gender wars, we have the colour wars, we have the sexual preference wars, then we have the vaccine wars, and we've got all these different divisions within society where we have been divided so we can be conquered. And we can see that when we're all one, and this is what's very powerful about Ukraine. Ukraine is so united. They become a superpower against a superpower. And the reason why Ukraine is so powerful is because they are so united. But if they were divided, Even if you look at the history of China and Japan, a little tiny nation of Japan used to conquer regularly China and push them around like real bullies. And how was it that this massive land with all of these millions and millions, even billions of people back then, how could they be pushed around by this tiny nation that was Japan? Well, the reason is because China wasn't united. China had all of these different provinces with different emperors and different people, and they could never really get their stuff together to be one united front. And as a result, a very small Japan could come in and dominate them. And we're seeing the inversion of this at the moment, where a big, powerful, questionably divided nation such as Russia, because we've seen that some unrest even within the Russian people, they can't quite conquer Ukraine yet because they are so united. So I realise that was a long rant, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that some argue, and I tend to argue it as well, is that it's not all just a coincidence. All of this, the international campaign of terrorism, dividing us through genders, sexual preferences, colours, and so forth. And then the division of the vax and the unvax, and the mandate and the non-mandate. And now we have a solution to this. And there's a lot of misinformation about what Bitcoin offers us. The easy answer from the government is it's a scam, it's a Ponzi scheme. Okay, well, maybe that's projection.
Well, yes, and it's very interesting, isn't it, that in certain mainstream media quarters, there's always a particular tack that they take whenever they talk about, for example, the Bitcoins and what have you, right? Which suggests that perhaps there is a bit of an agenda going on with regard to how people are being taught to think about it, right? And so I'm a great believer in, what I try to do on this channel is to help people think about things differently, right? Not necessarily preach a particular solution, but ask some questions and perhaps think about it differently, right? Because that's what I think mature adults should be able to do. My concern is that we have a set of norms in society that seems to be looking for very simple, almost naive solutions for things, one-line answers or 30-minute videos or 30-second videos or whatever it is, right? Rather than actually wanting to get into a real understanding of what's really going on. And, when you start talking then about some of these coincidental things that are happening, or are they actually orchestrated? Is there a bit of a plan behind the scenes to be able to take us to a particular future, right? Which is, as has been said before, you won't own anything, but you'll be happy, right? Well, is that the sort of future we want? To what extent is there still an opportunity to empower individuals and help everyone make better decisions, or do we just simply, like kids basically just say, okay, well, we'll do whatever you tell us to do, right? And I don't want to be in that sort of society. I think, I want to be in a society where I can make my own decisions, go my own way, do my own things within the limits of the law. But also you need to understand that the law is set by somebody who has a particular worldview that may not be the same as your view. And sometimes what is required to be done by law is not necessarily right from a civil liberties perspective, for example. There are some really big contentions here, right? And then if you overlay the financial stuff and the money stuff that we've been talking about, shot through the middle of all this societal conversation is finance and how finance works and who controls it and to what extent is there freedom or not freedom. That's why this is a really important integrated conversation. You can't just talk about Bitcoin as a speculative investment. You've got to think about it in the context of some of these broader thematics that we've been touching on to understand how it plays in to what potentially is a bigger agenda. And this is an agenda about the future of humanity. I mean, I don't think I'm overstating it. There are really some very open, genuinely open questions here about the future of society, the future of humanity. What do we want society to be? What do we want our politicians to be? And, all of those things. That should be part of the debate that we should be having.
I like to say, when it comes to Bitcoin, I came for the Lambo and I stayed for the evolution. That is, many people come into Bitcoin because I think, I'm going to get this big house and Lambo. And in many cases, that's true. But it's so much bigger than that. It is none of that. It is so much bigger than just the Lambo and the big house. That is just a fortunate consequence of getting into this space, that you get all of this money and freedom. But here's the thing, Martin, this is why I do have hope. If all of this was orchestrated, that is how societies are being pushed around, there's two things that they didn't account for. the internet of knowledge and the internet of money. So the internet of knowledge, let's go through that first. Right now, you and I are essentially a television production. You and I, sitting in our homes, broadcasting to planet Earth to anyone who wants to tune in. There is no way we could have done this 20 years. We had centralized media outlets that they controlled the narrative. There was no space, there was no platform, there was no technology where two Aussie blokes who have never met in person, who have completely different backgrounds, could come together and commentate on the world and experiences around us. That's the internet of knowledge, and that is what alternative media is about. The mainstream will paint it as something bad. You know, if you're not hearing it from Channel 7 and ABC, it's all a lie. It's like, oh, really? Is that so? Well, I believe it was ABC who released a big documentary saying Trump colluded with Russia. And we saw that that was not the case. And yet my tax dollars had to fund this lie that the government funded broadcaster was putting out to the people. So the internet of knowledge has enabled the decentralization of media, the decentralization of information and conversation. Now we extend this to the decentralization of money. No longer do we have to go through centralized bodies such as the SWIFT network, the United States dollar, or all the banks who all lie in bed together. You and I can just transact together. So if this were all to be orchestrated to push people to not own anything and be happy, which to me sounds like something like communism, and we know that communism always fails, we now have the antithesis, the solution, the potion to all of this, which is decentralized media, the internet of information, and decentralized money, the internet of money.
Absolutely right. Very, very interesting. Well, we're coming up to the end of our time. Gee, we seem to run out of... I think somebody's devalued the minute. That's what I think, because I reckon we've been talking about 30 minutes, but actually it's an hour and a half. So, look, wow. Amazing, but true. So I want to say, Adam, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. You know, as with all of these conversations, there'll be people who violently disagree in the chat, and I've put a few of those up, but some I haven't put up. But that's not the point, right? The point is, if we've been able to help people think through some of these issues and explore different ways of looking at the world, and then in a way, I think I've succeeded, and hopefully, you know, you succeeded in helping people to think a little bit different, a little bit more deeply. If they want to find out more about Crypto Land and what you do, where do they go?
Thank you for asking, and thanks for having me on. And just before I go into that, well done on what you do, Martin, because I've enjoyed our journey together over many years, and you've always remained curious. And your philosophical background is that it's okay to disagree. It's okay to hear a different opinion, but test your own ideas. Everyone, keep testing your own ideas. If you believe in something, do a little thought experiment and challenge yourself. If you come up the other end and you find that, you know, you still stand where you stand, so be it. But if you pivot on your position, well, think how liberating that can be, particularly if it frees your money or your family financially. But to answer your question, you can come over to my channel. That's Adam Stokes, just ADAMSTOKES on YouTube. Or you can check out my book, 28 Pro Trader Tips, The Art of Trading, on Amazon. Finally, if you want to do anything crypto safely, head over to thecrypto.land. That's thecrypto.land, where you can do everything crypto safely on one secure site.
Terrific, Adam. Well, thanks for your time once again, and we'll pick up the conversation down the road, I'm sure. Keep your enthusiasm up, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Martin. Great working with you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take you offline now. Thank you very much for that, Adam. And just before I go, one very important doggy cam. So the dogs haven't moved all evening. They're still there, still asleep. But frankly, I guess given the weather out there, it's probably not a bad thing. And just in terms of next week, I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to have the New Liberals back next week. So Victor Klein and Steve Keen. Steve Keen. I obviously missed a T out. My apologies there. Steve Keen, who will be talking a little bit about some of the political landscape ahead of the election. There's an election, of course, due now within 90 days or so. So that'll be worth watching. That's next week. So mark your diaries and come and ask some questions, political questions, or broader questions to those two people. They'll be on next week. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much for your time spent with us tonight. I hope you found it interesting, insightful. Follow me, of course, like the show if you've not done so already, and I'll see you next week live. And in the meantime, you can always watch my daily shows, which are now back in full force, having pulled myself through my recent personal issues, and we're now running on all cylinders again. So I look forward to seeing you again on one of the shows, and thank you very much for spending some time with us tonight, and thanks for all those who made a contribution by the super chat. Really appreciate it. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. We'll see you next time.